again to another episode where we study for folk literature UGC NET. And I'm also an aspirant. So, in case you feel that there is something more to speak about, there is something more to discuss about, kindly reach out to me and I'll surely try to use all of those keywords and elaborate on it through these videos. Also, if you like this content and you feel that this is important to reach out to the students who would be sitting for UGC NET for this June 2024 and even later on, do like it, do share it with others, and please subscribe to my channel. So today we would be doing the unit 2, which is historiography of folkloristics, and it would be a complete guide, and mostly it is going to be a text heavy episode. So stay tuned with me. So here are the topics which I would be covering today, from antiquities to lore, Arnie Thompson's and historic geographic method, global folklore studies, linear and non-linear concepts of time in folklore, oracy and literacy, subaltern studies, tribal studies, diaspora studies, and green studies. So let's start for the day and dive into the topic which comes from history of folklore. So from antiquities to lore. It is well documented that the term folklore was coined in 1846 by the Englishman William Thoms. So he fabricated it for use in an article published in August 2022, 1846, and the issue was of the Athenaeum. So Thoms consciously replaced the contemporary terminology of popular antiquities or popular literature with the new word. What was this new word? It was folklore. So folklore was to emphasize the study of specific subset of population, the rural, mostly illiterate peasantry. In his published call for help in documenting these antiquities, he was echoing scholars from across the European continent to collect these artifacts and mostly oral cultural traditions which are still flourishing among the rural populations. So in Germany, the Brothers Grimm had their first published book, which was Kinder und Hausmärchen, and it was in 1812, which was a collection of fairy tales for children, and it was sort of household tales. So they continued throughout their lives to collect the German folk tales to include their collection. So in Scandinavia, on the other hand, throughout their lives, the intellectuals were also searching for these authentic Teutonic roots and had labeled their studies Folkemind, which is in Danish, or Folkemine, which is in Norwegian. So throughout Europe and America, other early collectors of folklore were at work. With increasing industrialization, the urbanization, and the rise in literacy throughout Europe in the 19th century, folklorists were kind of concerned that oral knowledge and the belief, the lore of the rural folk would be lost. So it was posited that the stories, the beliefs, the customs were surviving fragments of the cultural mythology of the region, predating Christianity and rooted in the pagan people and their belief. So this thinking goes in lockstep with rise of nationalism across Europe. Some British folklorists, rather than lamenting on attempting to preserve the rural or pre-industrial cultures, they saw their work as a means of furthering industrialization, scientific rationalism, and disenchantment. So, as the need to collect these vestiges of rural traditions became more compelling, the need to formalize this new field of culture studies became very apparent. So the British Folklore Society was established in 1878 and American Folklore Society was established just a decade later, which was 1888. And these two were a plethora of academic societies which got founded later on in the later of the 19th century. And students of folklore was someone else, and past was recognized as being something truly different because it was mostly an urban society by then. So folklore became a measure of a progress of a society, how far we have moved forward into the industrial present, and indeed we removed ourselves from the past marked by poverty, illiteracy, and superstition. So the task of both the professional folklorist and the amateur at the turn of the 20th century was to collect and classify these cultural artifacts from the pre-industrial rural areas and to parallel the drive in the life sciences to do the same in the natural world. So Folk was a clear label to set materials apart from modern life, material specimens which were meant to be classified in natural history of the civilization. So tales originally dynamic and fluid were given stability and concreteness by the means of a printed page in writing. So viewed as fragmentation from the pre-literate culture, these stories and objects were collected without the context and was displayed and studied in the museums and anthologies, just as bones or post. Potsherds and gathered for life sciences. Now, Karl Ron and Antti Arne, they were active collectors of folk poetry in Finland. So the Scotsman Andrew Lang is known for his 25 volumes of Andrew Lang's fairy books from around the world. So Francis James Shields was an American academic who collected these English and Scottish popular ballads and their American variants and published as child ballads. So in United States, Mark Twain was another person who was a charter member of American Folklore Society, and both he and the Washington Irving they drew on the folklore to write their stories. So in 1825, novel Brother Jonathan by John Neal is recognized as the most extensive literary use of American folklore of its time. From the history, we now move on to Arne Thompson and the historic geographic method to understand that how these theories kind of evolved in studying folklore. So by the beginning of 20th century, these collections had grown to include artifacts from around the world and across several cultures, across several centuries. And a system to organize and categorize them became really necessary. So Anti Arne published this first classification system of folktales in 1910. So it was later expanded to Arne Thompson's classification system by Stith Thompson, and it remains a standard classification system for European folktales and other types of oral literature. So as this number of classified artifacts grew, similarities were noted in items which had been collected from different geographical regions, from different ethnic groups, and from different epochs. In an effort to understand and explain the similarities found in the tales from different locations, and the Finnish folklorists Julius and Karl Ron, they developed a historical geographical method, also called the Finnish method. So, using multiple variants of one particular tale, this investigative method attempted to work towards backward in time, not towards the future, but towards backward in the past, and location also to move back to the location from where the original version had been compiled. So, what they considered as incomplete fragments in existence at that time in the present, this was a search of UR form, which, by the definition, the geographic method had been more succinctly described as a quantitative mining of results of archives and extraction of distribution patterns in different time and space. So it is based on the assumption that every text artifact is a variant of the original text. So, as a proponent of this method, Walter Anderson proposed additionally a law of self correction, that is, a feedback mechanism which would keep the variants closer to the original form. It was during the first decade of 20th century that the folklore studies in Europe and America began to diverge. So the Europeans continued with their emphasis on the oral literature, oral traditions, and the pre-literate peasants, and remained connected to the literary scholarship within the universities. By this definition, folklore was completely based on European cultural sphere. Any social group that did not originate in Europe was to be studied by ethnologists and cultural anthropologists. So, in the slide, some 21st century scholars have interpreted European folklorists as an instrument of internal colonialism in parallel with imperialistic dimensions in the early 20th century cultural anthropology and Orientalism. Unlike the contemporary anthropology, and however, many early European folklorists were themselves the members of prioritized groups of the folkloristics was intended to study. For instance, Andrew Lang, James George Fraser were both themselves Scotsmen, and they studied these rural folk tales from the towns from where they have grown up. In contrast to the American folklorists under the influence of German American Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, sought to incorporate all other cultural groups living in the region to study the folklore. So this also included not only the customs brought over by the northern European immigrants, but also the African Americans, Acadians of Eastern Canada, Cajuns of Louisiana, Hispanics of the American Southwest, and the Native Americans as well. So not only were these distinct cultural groups all living in the same region, but their proximity to each other caused their traditions and customs to intermingle. And the lore of these distinct social groups, all of them Americans, was considered the bailiwick of American folklorists and aligned American folklore studies more with ethnology than with the literary studies. Now, I would like to speak about the Federal Writers Project. So, then came the 1930s and the worldwide Great Depression. In the United States, the Federal Writers Project was established as a part of WPA, and its goal was to offer paid employment to thousands of unemployed writers by engaging them in various cultural projects around the country. So these white collar workers were sent out as field workers to collect the oral folklore of their regions, including the stories, songs, idioms, and dialects. The most famous of these collections is the slave narrative collection. So the folklore collected under the Federal Writers Project during these years continues to offer to be a gold mine of primary source materials for the folklorists and other cultural historians. In Europe, during these same decades, folklore studies were drifting in a very different direction. Throughout 19th century, folklore has been tied to romantic ideals of soul in the people, in which folk tales and folk songs recounted the lives of and exploits of ethnic folk heroes. Folklore chronicled the mythical origins of different peoples across the Europe and established the beginnings of national pride. By the first decade of 20th century, there were scholarly societies as well as individual folklore positions within the university, academics, and museums. However, the study of German folks, folklore had yet to be defined as an academic discipline. So in 1920s, this originally an apolitical movement was a beginning point to nationalism in several European countries, including Germany, and where it was absorbed to be the emerging Nazi ideology. German folklore, such as Ras, which is race, Stamm, which was tribe, Erb, which was heritage, were frequently referenced by the Nazi party. So their expressed goal was to re-establish what they perceive as former purity of the Germanic people of Europe. So the German and the anti-Nazi philosopher Ernst Bloch, he was one of the main analysts and critics of this ideology. And later, it became the Nazi ideology and presented the concept of racial purity as the means to heal the wounds of the suffering German state following the World War One. So Hitler, he painted the ethnic heterogeneity of Germany as a major reason for the country's economic and political weakness, and he promised to restore this German based on restore this German realm based on a cleansed and hence a stronger racially pure society in Germany. And that was the goal of Nazis and intent of forging a greater Germanic tribe or folk. So in post-war years, the departments of folklores were established in multiple German universities. However, an analysis of just how folklore studies supported the policy of the Third Reich, it did not begin until 20 years after World War II in West Germany, particularly in the works of Hermann Bossinger and Wolfgang Emmerich in 1960s. It was pointed out that the vocabulary current in Volkskunde or folklore was ideally suited for the kind of ideology that a National Socialist had built up. So after the World War II, the discussion continued about whether to align these folklore studies with literature or ethnology. And within the discussion, many voices were actively trying to identify the optimal approach to take the analysis of folklore artifacts. One major change had already been initiated by Franz Boas, and the culture was no longer viewed in evolutionary terms by then. Each culture has its own integrity and completeness and was not progressing either towards the wholeness or towards fragmentation. So individual artifacts must have been the meaning within the culture or for the individuals themselves in order to assume cultural relevance and assure the continued transmission of the culture. So, because European folklore movement had been primarily oriented towards the oral traditions, a new term called folk life was introduced to be represented in full range of traditional culture. This included music, dance, storytelling, crafts, costume, foodways, and much more. So, in this period, folklore came to be referred to the event of doing something or within the given context for a specific audience, using artifacts as necessary props in the communication of traditions between the individual and within the groups. So, beginning in 1970s, these new areas of folklore studies became articulated in performance studies where traditional behaviors are evaluated and understood within the context of their performance. A performance can take place either within a cultural group, reiterating and reinforcing the customs and belief of a group, or it can be a performance or for an outside group in which first goal is to set up the performers apart from the audience, and in both the cases the differentiations are very vivid. So the analysis then goes beyond the artifact itself, be it dance or storytelling, it goes beyond the performers and their message. As part of performance studies, the audience becomes part of the performance. If any folklore performance strays too far from the audience expectations, it will be likely to brought back by the means of negative feedback loop of next reiteration. Both performer and audience are acting within this twin laws of folklore transmission, in which there's novelty, innovation, and that is quite much balanced by the conservative forces of the familiar. So even further, the presence of a folk lore observer at a performance of any kind will influence the performance itself in very subtle and not so subtle ways. Because folklore is firstly an act of communication between two parties. It is incomplete if any of the party is not receptive enough. So, the understanding of folklore performance as communication leads directly to modern linguistic theory and communication studies theories. Words both reflect and shape our worldview. Oral traditions, particularly in stability over generations and even centuries, provide significant insight into the ways in which insiders of a culture see and understand and express their responses to the world around them. So we'll be doing it in little more details while we will be doing the theories. But still, I just wanted to put it through here in the flow to understand the historical context of the theories. So in 2015, there was the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And there's something very important about it. Three major approaches of folklore interpretation were developed during this second half of 20th century. And structuralism in folklore studies attempts to, one was structuralism, one was functionalism, and the other was psychoanalytic interpretation. So, structuralism in folklore attempts to define the structure underlying the oral and customary folklore, while the functionalism in folklore studies also came to the forefront following the World War II. And as a spokesman, William Bascom formulated these four functions of folklore. And this approach takes more top-down approach and understands how a specific form fits into and expresses meaning within a culture as a whole. Um, and another one was psychoanalytic interpretation, which was championed by Alan Jones and his monographs, including the study of homoerotic subtext in the American football and elements in German folklore, which were not always appreciated and involved. Jones in several major folklore studies into certain controversies during his career, but this was a very significant approach to understand folklore. And with a passage in 1976 of the American Folklife Preservation Act, folklore studies in the United States came of age. And this legislation follows in the footsteps of other legislation designed to safeguard more tangible aspects of our national heritage worthy of protection. So this law also marks a shift in our national awareness. It gives a voice to national understanding that diversity within the country is a unifying feature, not something which separates us. So we no longer view cultural differences as a problem to be solved, but as a tremendous opportunity. In diversity of American folk life, we find a marketplace teamed with exchange of traditional forms of cultural ideas, a rich resource of for the Americans. And this diversity is celebrated annually at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and many other folklife festivals around the country. We go to the next part, which is the linear and non-linear concepts of time. Why this is important to understand, because while we will be going through the the theories which are based on these concepts of linearity and non-linearity of time in folklore and how to approach it through the different theories, we need to understand the logic behind it. So that's why I have use this particular topic here. So another baseline of Western thought has also been thrown into the disarray in the recent past. And in Western culture, we live in time of progress, which is moving forward from one moment to the next. The goal is to become better and better, and culmination in the perfection. So in a model, time is linear with direct casuality, with direct causality in progression. You reap what you sow, a stitch in time saves nine, alpha and omega, the Christian concept of afterlife, all exemplify a cultural understanding of time as linear and progressive. So, in folklore studies, going backwards in time was also a valid venue of exploration. So the goal of the early folklorists of the historic geographic school was to reconstruct from the fragments of the folk tales the UR text or the original mythic pre-Christian worldview. When the and where was an artifact documented? So those were the important questions posed by early folklorists in their collections. They were also armed with data points, a grid pattern of time-space coordinates for the artifacts which would be plotted. Now awareness has grown, and different cultures have different concepts of time and space. So in a study, the American Indian mind in a linear world, Donald Fixico, he describes an alternate concept of time. Like in Indian thinking, it involves seeing things from a perspective that enhances or emphasizes that circles and cycles are central to the world, and that all things are related within the universe. He then suggests that the concept of time for Indian people has been such a continuum that time has become less relevant, and the rotation of life or season of the year are stressed as important. So, in a more specific example, the folklorist Per Tolkien describes the Navajo as living circular times, which is echoed and reinforced in the sense of space, the traditional curricular or multi-sided way. So, lacking the European mechanistic devices of marking time, like the clocks, the watches, the calendars, they're dependent on cycles of nature: sunrise, sunset, winter, summer. So, their stories and histories are not marked by decades or centuries, but remain close in as they circle around the constant rhythm of natural world. Within the last decade of time scale has expanded from unimaginably small nanoseconds to unimaginably large deep time. In comparison, our working concept of time as present, past, and future looks almost quaint. How do we map tradition into this multiplicity of time scales? Folklore studies has already acknowledged this in their study of traditions, which are either done in an annual cycle of circle time. For example, Christmas or May Day, or a life cycle of linear time, which is weddings or funerals. This needs to be expanded to other traditions of oral lore. For folk narrative is not linear chain of isolated tellings going from one single performance to other single performance of our time space grid to also, it is instead, it fits better into a non-linear system when one performer varies the story of telling to the next, and the performers under study starts to tell the story, also varying each performance in response to the multiplicity of the factors involved in it. Now, if we come to oracy and literacy, Walter Ong characterized a main difference between the languages of oral and literate cultures in certain terminologies. So, it is possible to generalize somewhat the psychodynamics of primary oral cultures, that is, of oral cultures untouched by writing. Fully literate persons can only, with great difficulty, imagine what a primary oral culture would look like. And that is a culture which no means whatsoever of writing or even the possibility of writing. So, in a primary oral culture, thought and expression tend to be into these, set into these pointers, additive rather than the first one is additive rather than subordinate. So, mostly we see that one performance, when we compare one performance to another, rather than being subordinate to the other, it's mostly additive, right? So, when we are talking about a text or a literate society where we are reading the text cannot be changed. So sometimes it can be taken that this is more dominant culture, but then the fluidity of and the variancy one gets to know the multiplicity of the factors involved in it, that creates a sense of additiveness in the oral cultures or oracy. Now, another factor which Ong speaks about is as being the aggregative rather than an analytic. So while the oral cultures are more aggregative, they speak in terms of aggregation and not analytic in terms of when they are speaking about something. So they are also redundant or copious in nature, because one particular incident could be spoken in so many other ways in n number of times in a particular story through different instances, through different devices. So that's why oral cultures tend to be more redundant. Now, another thing which he mentioned was that the oral cultures are more conservative or traditionalist. So they are more close to the human life world. Why? Because what they are speaking, that is day-to-day life for them, right? And they are agnostically toned. So many, if not all, oral or residually oral cultures strikes literates as extraordinarily agnostic in their verbal performance and indeed in their lifestyle. Also, empathetic, participatory, and objectively distant is are again another parts of the oral cultures. Also, the oral cultures are homeostatic, which means that it has its own power to change itself. It has this fluidity and organic stability in terms of change in perspective of time, space, and different dimensions. Now, if we move on to subaltern studies, at a very early inception of folklore, the very nature of folk was only sense of subaltern. And some folklorists, such as Vladimir Prop, have opined that folklore is first and foremost and the arts of oppressed classes, both the peasants and the workers, but also of the intermediate strata that gravitate towards lower social classes. The term subaltern has long and illustrious past. During the Middle Ages, it was primarily used to describe serfs and peasants in the England, and military's lower ranks later adopted in 1700s. So after Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist and Communist Party leader, it gained a widespread scholarly acceptance. Gramsci situates folklore in a socio-cultural context within the framework of a nation and its culture, but in opposition to official worldviews. So Gramsci's worldview is that folklore is distinctive of strata of society, namely people, which can be defined as all the subaltern and instrumental classes of every civilization that has existed up to now. So therefore, the diverse collective things, consequently folklore, must be viewed as a reflection of people's cultural circumstances, he says. Now, here comes the class. Now, here comes the power negotiations, the class politics, then the hegemonic, rule, and any, dominance on the other secondary, people in the secondary part of the society who are mostly not able to keep up with their voices. Now we move on to diaspora studies. So both in methodological and conceptual terms, the study of migration and new media and different methods of conducting online research have emerged during the last decades, remain one of the focal points of the research on international migration today. Of central importance here is the diminishing importance of the territorial aspects and the borders in defining identity in national terms, as well as overall reconfiguration of spatiality and locality, and the shift to the perception of nations as networks. So those who find themselves working in the field of diaspora studies will quickly notice the broad scope and of the discipline, and those subject matters seems to be, in the state of flux with the changing and contexted definitions of the term diaspora. Yet the term has become a very important part of how we make sense of experiences of people in the modern globalized transnational world. So this module traces with the genesis of the concept in the social sciences and emergence of the field of diaspora studies. Then you move on to green studies. So due to new ecological and ethical, bioethical findings within the wider social and cultural context, the changed condition around the world, which ultimately caused the focus to shift from anthropocentrism to the ecocentrism. The Slovenian research environment also requires the studies of both animals, zoo folklore, ethnozoology, eco-criticism, and nature, like eco folklore, eco poetics, eco botany, cultural botany, and human relationships to them as represented in folklore, literature, and culture. So, zoo folkloristics is another new discipline inside the classical folklore studies, which is based on the views of animal as a real creature and not as a symbol or metaphor. So the discipline tries to expand the critical view of the animal knowledge about the relationships between humans and the other animals, and exceptional messages about cohabitation of humans, non-humans on one side, and relationships with cultural practices which are not acceptable today on the other side. So here we come to the end of today's episode. I'm sure it was informative enough. In case you want to share anything specific about the UGC NET folk literature syllabus, or anything, any particular topic in particular which you need more expansion, I would love to try to expand you through my videos. Also, in case you feel that more importance should be given to a certain part of the syllabus, do let me know. So my mail ID is given in the description box. Do reach out to me in case you find this content relevant to you. See you very soon again with another part of folk literature for UGC NET. Keep on studying. Do not lose focus, and keep an eye on the question papers, last year question papers, previous year's question papers also. So see you all. Bye bye.